Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. When my wife and I bought our dream home in a nice suburban neighborhood last year, we thought we had found our perfect little slice of paradise. The houses were spacious but not ostentatious, with neat front lawns and friendly neighbors who waved hello. Well, most of the neighbors were friendly anyway. There was one woman who seemed to have a permanent scowl fixed on her face, like she had just caught a whiff of something rotten. That was Karen Smith, the head of the Homeowners Association Board. Karen was the quintessential, uptight homeowner association president, who took her job way too seriously. She would patrol the neighborhood in her little golf cart looking for any minor infractions she could write up. Your grass half an inch too long? That's a violation notice. Accidentally left your trash cans out an extra day. Here's another violation with a fine. She was infamous for showing up at people's front doors with her clipboard and hectoring them for the tiniest of transgressions. I tried to avoid Karen as much as possible after our first unfortunate encounter, when she informed me that my mailbox was the wrong shade of black according to homeowner association guidelines. But after a few blissfully Karen-free months, she started targeting me again for petty nonsense. Most of the citations were for things that didn't seem to actually be against any homeowner association rules. It was almost like she was singling me out to harass. The situation came to a head one Saturday morning when I was washing our cars in the driveway. Karen came zooming up in her golf cart and stood there imperiously observing me with her beady little eyes. "You missed a spot on the hood," she said smugly. I stopped what I was doing and turned to face her. "Excuse me? Is there something I can help you with?" "You're not allowed to wash cars in your driveway. That's against homeowner association rules," she declared. This was news to me. "I'm pretty sure there's no rule about that in the bylaws. I have thoroughly read all the homeowner association guidelines," I replied evenly. "Well, I'm in charge of the board, and I say it's not allowed. I'll have to write you up for this violation," she said with a smug little smile. I was rapidly losing patience. "Feel free to show me where in the CC and Rs this prohibited activity is mentioned," I challenged her. Karen's smug expression wavered. "Never you mind about that. I know the rules, and as president, I have the authority to enforce them as I see fit." I shook my head in disbelief. "No, actually you don't. You can't just make up rules and harass residents who aren't breaking any actual homeowner association bylaws." Karen turned red and sputtered, "How dare you question me? I'm the president, and what I say goes around here." I stood my ground. "Check the bylaws. You don't have unilateral authority to do whatever you want. Now please leave. You're trespassing." She gasped dramatically. "Why, I never. You can't speak to me that way." I picked up my cell phone. "Either cite an actual rule I'm violating or get off my property immediately, or I will call the police to report trespassing," I said firmly. Karen looked like she wanted to argue more, but instead she just let out an aggravated huff and zoomed away in her golf cart. I thought I had seen the last of her nonsense. I was wrong. A few days later, I got an official notice from the Homeowner Association Board that I was being fined $200 for unauthorized vehicle washing activities and disrespectful behavior towards Homeowner Association Board President. Plus, there was a warning that any repeat occurrences would result in further fines. This was the last straw. I called my next-door neighbor Jim, who I knew was also fed up with Karen's frequent harassment. Jim was a real estate attorney. He informed me that not only was Karen violating homeowner association bylaws with her bogus fines, but her retaliatory behavior could open her up to personal liability as well. Jim helped me draft a letter informing Karen that we would be filing a lawsuit against her unless the fines were withdrawn, and she ceased her harassing behavior immediately. Karen did not take kindly to this letter. She showed up at my door, face purple with rage, and screamed that I had no right to threaten her, and she could make my life very difficult. I calmly reiterated that her fake fines were illegal, and we had every right to take legal action if she didn't stop. That was when things got really crazy. A few days later, while my wife and I were out, Karen hired a crew to dig up our entire front lawn, leaving nothing but a muddy pit. We caught her on video executing her vindictive scheme to destroy our yard. We immediately got a restraining order against Karen while Jim helped us file a lawsuit against her personally. The video footage of Karen destroying our property was the last nail in her coffin. Once it came out and the other neighbors realized just how unhinged she was, The Homeowner Association Board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president. Karen was forced to pay for repairs to our yard out of her own pocket, on top of the damages awarded by the court for harassment and illegal fines. The best part? Karen had to sell her house and move out of the neighborhood to avoid bankruptcy from the judgment against her. She slunk away in disgrace, leaving the rest of us to finally live in peace. The new homeowner association president was a reasonable man who promised no more ridiculous fines or harassment. Order and tranquility were restored. My neighbor Jim explained that power-crazed homeowner association bosses like Karen were not uncommon, but we were fortunate to have caught her egregious behavior on video and been able to hold her accountable. After we won the case against Karen, Jim and I both joined the homeowner association board to try to prevent any future dictators from abusing their authority. As for Smug Homeowner Association Karen, her dreams of ruling the neighborhood with an iron fist died an embarrassing death. Turns out, trying to act like you own the whole neighborhood can backfire big time. The next one is a pro-revenge story. So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He had started in the Marines, but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out, he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a Repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, whom I'll refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities, but was a force for good, if you can believe that. While they were talking, they saw a young man enter the office. They immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and an arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned but I'll call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began by telling her that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood. Not a good idea, by the way, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment, he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that shortly after buying the car, he had met the local girl, who, for the sake of the story, I'll call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he would always decline. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car, but he kept saying no. After much needling, he relented, but on the condition that she take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of his place. When Ben came back for leave, he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage, drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked into his apartment, he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom, he found his room had been torn apart. All of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found it hadn't been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his, and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's, he saw a car there that he initially didn't recognize, but as they got closer, he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure, and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door, and Morgan answered. He asked what happened to his car, and she responded, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the crap out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his concealed carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly not sure if the cops were called on this. I'd assume yes, but even then, Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital at random times, and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it to her, and Karen had a smile form on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it, but wasn't aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they'd met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently, Morgan agreed, and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with the pink monster, parked it, and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day, it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her if she had the registration, she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was going to call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in the car on the passenger side. Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed. The owner okayed it. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they weren't allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went back to the office, all hell had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she'd call her friends to finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point, and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop. Brock retrieved the laptop from the car, and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it, but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived, and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen, and Karen gave her a casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security videos. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats she made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence of her beating him up. She was arrested, and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted he didn't want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. Brock had a few more stories, but none of them were nearly as good as this one. The next one is a petty revenge story. One day, many years ago, I received an email addressed to someone who shared my first initial and last name. For the purpose of this story, I'll call him G-Man. As with anyone who uses a common email address, think first initial plus last name, you sometimes get an email that isn't meant for you. Mostly it was incidental things like receipts and the occasional personal email. I attributed them to being a data entry error. Perhaps they misheard the email address, and instead of typing in gc lastnamedagmail.com, they typed in glastnamedagmail.com. No big deal. In the cases where I could, I politely replied to the sender informing them that I wasn't the intended recipient and asking them to please inform G-Man that he was using the wrong email address. However, my attempts were never successful. I would still receive emails intended for G-Man, and they were often things that I would consider important, like order receipts or emails with confirmation numbers attached to them. I tried to track down G-Man, but to no avail. There were multiple G-Man last name profiles on social media, making it impossible to 100% confirm which one was the right one. And so, This continued for years. Until one day I received a personal email addressed to G-Man that mentioned the company he worked for. Aha, now I had something. I looked him up. It turns out that G-Man is the systems manager at said company. His LinkedIn bio states that he's an IT professional. That's interesting. I found his company email and forwarded him the email, also advising him that the other address he's using is associated with another person. I kindly asked him to be more careful with his email addresses. Once again, I was polite in my request. He replied and apologized. I thought, it's finally over, but it wasn't over. Oh no, far from it. The emails I received that were addressed to G-Man actually began to increase in volume. Now I was receiving emails for mailing lists and account signups and all sorts of other things. This guy, this so-called IT professional, was clearly using my email address as his spam dump, knowing that it was going to an actual person. I had to sift through dozens upon dozens of emails daily as a result, and as we all know, once you're on one mailing list, you tend to end up on a lot more mailing lists. By now, I had concluded that this person was deliberately being a nuisance, so it was time to take action. I decided to extract revenge whenever I could. It started out simple enough. If I received an account sign-up, I would click the link to verify it and then promptly log in and deactivate the account. It worked for a while, but then there would be another sign-up. So I got more creative. I would log into the account, change all the information, and most importantly, the password, usually to something like, I am a gigantic a hole. This left the account active but totally inaccessible since any attempt at password recovery sent the email to my account, which I promptly ignored and deleted. Hotel booking? I would log in and cancel it the day before he was due to arrive. I'm guessing he never received the notice because it was all coming to my email. Basically, anything I could do to inconvenience G-Man, I did it. This back and forth continued for years. In fact, I still occasionally receive emails intended for the guy. Then one day it happened. I received an email receipt for an order that G-Man had placed. It had the recipient's name and address, but more importantly, it had G-Man's address on it. Queue up. I've got a golden ticket. I finally had the means for the ultimate revenge. I took his address and signed him up for everything I could find. Free samples, for example, adult diapers, feminine products, and lube. Catalogs, normal, not so normal, and raunchy. I spent an entire day finding anything I could enter his address into and dutifully filled it out. But the coup de grace, the cherry on top. When I was looking for things to sign up for, I stumbled upon a website that allowed you to order free flooring samples, various sizes, some 12x12 squares. Carpet, tile, wood, linoleum, whatever. I signed G-Man up for every sample I could find. Then I found another site offering the same thing, and I did it again and again and again until the point where I literally lost track of how many free flooring samples I had signed him up for. My guess, it was easily in the hundreds, if not thousands. I literally carpet-bombed G-Man. Coincidentally, the email volume certainly decreased. I never heard from G-Man either. Maybe he deleted my initial email and forgot, or maybe he was buried under all those flooring samples. Either way, I'm sure that once they started to arrive, he realized his mistake. I bet that to this day he still gets items delivered to that address. The next one is a malicious compliance story. On my first enlistment in the Army, I was a mechanic. In our unit, we had 3 staff sergeants for some reason. Sergeant T was in the last year of his contract and would be retiring. He was assigned as the motor supply sergeant, a position that was created so he could ride the pine since we were overstaffed. Sergeant G was assigned as the maintenance supervisor and oversaw the preventative maintenance and repair of the vehicles in the motor pool. The third one was our platoon sergeant and doesn't feature in the story. Every Monday, the vehicle operators would come to the motor pool to perform their weekly vehicle inspections. The mechanics would effect any repairs that were possible at the time, like changing out burnt bulbs, stuff that was easy and could get the vehicle rolling. Then we would begin performing repairs on any vehicle that had a deadline deficiency, a deficiency that needs to be repaired before the vehicle can be operated. These don't necessarily mean the vehicle isn't operational, just that operating the vehicle in that condition can cause greater problems. Then we'd fix the rest. Usually on Friday, we'd order any parts that we needed to repair what was left. After the operators left on Monday, the inspection sheets were divided up between the mechanics, and we got to work. One week I had a fairly easy workload and got all of my sheets finished by Wednesday. There was only one vehicle that had a deadline deficiency left, and the rest were ordering parts. The vehicle in question had been taken by the operators every day. I called the unit to let them know that the vehicle had a deadline deficiency and needed to return to the motor pool. They were short on vehicles and long on work and had been stalling, so I informed my squad leader and left it at that. I went to the office and began ordering parts. When my work was completed, I would assist other mechanics with theirs. Sergeant G walked in and asked why I was in the office, and I informed him that the rest of my work was complete, and I was ordering parts. He asked to see my inspection sheets and started looking through them. I tried to explain about the one vehicle, but he cut me off and said he'd see what the paper said. He saw the deadline deficiency and ordered me out to repair that vehicle immediately. I tried to object and explain the situation, but he cut me off again and ordered me to go out and fix the vehicle. I tried a third time to explain. Again, he cut me off and said, "I don't want your excuses. I want your ass out on the line fixing that truck. If I see you doing anything else before it's fixed, it'll be an Article 15. An Article 15 is non-judicial punishment and can result in a reduction of rank or forfeiture of pay." "Roger, Sarge, I'm on it." I walked to the rack of manuals for the vehicles, pulled the appropriate one, and found the size of the bolts on the part that needed to be changed. I grabbed my wrenches and headed out to the assigned spot for the vehicle. I laid down right there, raised my tools, and began making wrenching motions with my arms. I did this for over an hour, with some breaks, of course. Those were some giant wrenches. I saw people looking at me and pointing. Eventually, someone went to Sergeant T and told him what I was doing, and he came over to check it out. He watched me wrenching for a minute or two, head cocked. "What are you doing, squirrel?" "Fixing this truck, Sergeant. It's got a deadline." He was looking at me really funny now, like I had heat stroke or something. "Squirrel, you do realize that the truck ain't here, right?" "Sarge, I know this, and you know this, but Sergeant G doesn't want to hear my excuses. He wants my ass out on the line fixing this truck." Sergeant T told me to get up and get back to work. I told him that G had threatened an Article 15. He said he'd take care of it. I took a smoke break to give them time to resolve the issue before I went back to the office. Not sure what Sergeant T said, but G had a scowl on his face when I came back to order my parts. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.